Neighbors series and the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve that is putting it on. So I'm going to try sharing my screen. Let's see how that goes. And actually, that is not the slide I want. I'm going to go back to the beginning. There we go. Okay. So this is the third in our Wild Neighbors speaker series since we started going online. This series actually began last year as an in-person speaker series hosted by our partners at Concordia University, Texas. And it's a partnership with the Travis County Balcones Canyonlands Preserve and the City of Austin Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, which is through their Wildlands Division. And I'm going to just show you a map of the preserve to give you a little bit of an idea of why we have so many partners. So this map here shows the entire Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, which is over 50 square miles. It's one of the biggest urban preserves in the country. And I'm just gonna orient you guys real quick. If you can see my cursor moving over here in kind of the lower right is downtown Austin. That one is Mopac. And then this is the Colorado River following all the way out to Lake Travis. So everything that's a color on here, except for this guy up here in the upper left, which is the Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge, which we get confused with all the time because we have the same name. But everything else that's a color on here is part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And as you can see, it's a patchwork of different colors, which represent all of the partners that it took to come together and make this incredible preserve happen. So the purple is Travis County, which is where I work. The darker green is City of Austin. And this series, as I mentioned, is a partnership of the City of Austin and Travis County BCP. We also have a lot of really wonderful partners that we work with. Up here in the yellow, you can see Travis Audubon has their Baker Sanctuary that's part of it. Down in the lower part is Barton Creek Habitat Preserve, which is the Nature Conservancy. Concordia University has part of the preserve on their tract, and we have an easement over it, so the county manages it. That's why it's purple, but we co-manage it, and it's owned by Concordia. So anyway, lots of different folks coming together to make this happen. And this was actually all created as part of an agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to set up mitigation for the removal of other endangered species habitat. This was set aside to preserve really high quality habitat for endangered species in Western Travis County. And in exchange, there's an expedited permitting process for development in Western Travis County where there is these endangered species. So it's a great big compromise in the best sense of the word, and that's how we ended up with this amazing resource. So because we're a giant urban preserve, we have thousands and thousands of neighbors, and we get a lot of questions about wildlife from neighbors and from people further afield. And so that was a big part of why we decided to do this speaker series, to just, especially when there are a lot of folks who come in from out of town, from out of state, some international, are not necessarily familiar with a lot of the wildlife here. And a lot of us who grew up here don't know a lot about the wildlife. So we're just sharing information about what we have here in Central Texas, and also offering some tips about how we can coexist successfully and even help our wild neighbors survive and thrive. So see how I worked in that name of the speaker series. So moving on to the next slide, here are the species that the preserve was intended to protect, is why it was created. So we've got two migratory songbirds. Over here is the golden cheek warbler, probably one of the most famous of our species. Below it is the black-capped vireo, which was actually delisted. It's no longer considered endangered in 2018, but we do still preserve its habitat here on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And then we've got our karst invertebrates. We've got the pseudoscorpion, the beak Creek cave harvestman, the tooth cave ground beetle, the tooth cave spider, which actually is kind of translucent and has a little bit of a blue glow to it when you put light on it. It's very cool. Kretschmar cave mold beetle, and bone cave harvestman, and they're found in the sort of honeycomb of caves that we have throughout this area in the Balcones Canyonlands. So for those who are not familiar with that term, the Balcones Canyonlands are essentially the transition zone between the higher Edwards Plateau, which is also largely known as the Hill Country, Texas Hill Country, and then the Edwards Plateau to the east. And that dividing line is generally about the I-35 corridor aligns with the Balcones fault line, and so that's kind of the dividing line between those two areas. So the Balcones Canyonlands is a limited amount of area and it has a really unique ecosystem, and that's, you know, what we protect here on the preserve. It's pretty amazing. And by protecting these endangered species, which are the first to become endangered because they're generally the most vulnerable to the disturbances that are happening from development, from pollution, from all these different disturbances, by protecting the most vulnerable, we protect the whole ecosystem and all these incredible species. And we're always seeing things, you know, I'm learning every day about new species. We just have incredible diversity here, and it's a really special place. And we normally have guided hikes and volunteer opportunities for folks who want to come see the preserve, because the majority of it is not open to the public, although there are parks that are part of the preserve that are open. But our outreach activities, unfortunately, are suspended right now because of COVID transmission risk. But we hope as soon as we can to reopen those and welcome more people to the preserve. And we have maps. I can put the link to the interactive map in the chat session, the chat window there, so you can check out the different areas and which ones do have access. And so on the chat question there, so because we're asking everybody to mute their audio and visual, we are asking any questions to go into the chat window, and Jeremy Hull, who is my colleague at Travis County, is going to be reading those, and at the end he will read those to Dr. Hamayoun for Q&A at the end. And we are going to try to keep it to an hour, so we'll cut it off at 1, but any remaining questions you can email Dr. Hamayoun. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tanya Hamayoun, who is the Texas Nature Tracker biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that she can share hers. And take it away, Tanya.
Okay, can y'all hear me okay? All right. Make sure I get these settings in here right. Okay, y'all should be seeing my slide. Thumbs up on that?
Thumbs up on that.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So, as it often does, Zoom is giving me my little warning that says I have some low system resources. So what I'm gonna do is say hi to everybody, and then I'm gonna actually turn my camera off while I'm talking. The other thing I have a tendency to do is a whole lot of this, which can be really distracting. So I'll still be sitting here frantically gesturing as I'm talking, but y'all won't have to see it. So thanks for coming and joining us to learn a little bit about who's in your neighborhood. And I will also try to keep the bad owl puns to a minimum, but occasionally they just happen. So I will say, I work for Texas Parks and Wildlife, and while my position as a nature trackers biologist encompasses a whole variety of different organisms and getting people involved in community science across the state to help us learn more about them, my passion is for birds. So, and owls happen to be one of those birds that I've always loved since I was a little kid. So hopefully if you're not as enthusiastic about them, my goal is to see that you will be by the time we get done today. So that said, let's see here. My morning started off with quite the clamor outside. This is literally me leaning against my window, my bedroom window, to take this picture this morning at about probably about 6:35 or so. So I was woken up this morning at about 6 o'clock by a series of hoots coming from what I refer to affectionately as our landlords. We have a pair of great horned owls that have been pretty consistently hanging around our building. So that was pretty exciting. So I just thought that was kind of a great way to start off a day when I'd be getting to talk about owls. So we're going to talk a little about owls, who they are, the role in our ecosystems. And then what I think is also really kind of fascinating is how much they permeate our culture and our traditions and even our modern day memes. No matter where we are on the planet, owls are one of those groups of birds that are really widely distributed. And it seems that everyone has some kind of cultural connection to them. Then we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the fairly common owls that you may encounter in and around where you are, and then some kind of best practices for taking care of our feathered friends. So talking a little bit about conservation and management. So owls are their own order within the bird group, the class birds. And there are kind of two families that you can group owls into. We have what we call the true owls. So that's going to be most of the owls that we're going to be encountering photos of today. And then we have another family that are grouped as the barn owls. And so they're pretty distinctive from the true owls in their appearance, which kind of gets to this point that most of you guys are probably seeing the silhouette, and even if I had no other text on the screen, you would probably pretty quickly hone in that this is an owl just by the silhouette alone. So there's some things that are really distinctive about them. They have this upright posture. They tend to have a large head with a fairly flat face relative to other birds, forward-facing eyes, that distinctive pattern of behavior where they're active at night or nocturnal. One of the really cool features they have is that their feathers are designed for near silent flight. So they can be really, really stealthy when they choose to be. And those amazing sharp talons for capturing prey, and the fact that they're really important carnivores in our global ecosystems. So there are over 200 species of owls worldwide, with 19 of those residing in North America. They are found in nearly every type of terrestrial habitat we have on the planet. They range in size from our tiny little elf owl, which is about 6 inches long and weighs just a little bit more than a golf ball. They live in the southwestern US and central Mexican deserts. And then if you go over to Siberia and parts of northern Japan, you would find what is arguably the world's largest owl, 28 inches long, and can clock in somewhere around 9 pounds, the Blakiston's fish owl, which tends to live in these river corridors and some of these really cold environments. So really diverse group of birds. So some of the adaptations that they have that make them so cool. So we're looking right now at a depiction of how a pigeon sees the world versus how an owl sees the world. So we, with the way our human eyes are oriented on our head, we have very robust, what we call binocular vision. So we see through both of our eyes, just with the way that our eyes are oriented on our head. A lot of animals have eyes that are more oriented on the sides of their head, which give them a larger range of vision relative to us. So they can see, if a predator might be sneaking up on them from behind or even above or below, such as a pigeon, but they have a pretty limited scope of binocular vision. So owls, much like us, because they have those forward-oriented eyes, have about a 70-degree range of binocular vision and more limited monocular vision on either side. And those owl eyes are not just visually stunning, they're actually really cool and kind of unique. So when you picture an eyeball, you tend to think of, as the name implies, a ball. And owl eyes are actually really, really huge, and they're tube-shaped. So some species actually make up about 3% of the body weight. An example being the barred owl. So if we were talking about a 150-pound human, that means your eyes would weigh about 4.5 pounds, which is kind of a thing to ponder on today. They have absolutely amazing night vision, and what gives them that ability to see in the dark is that almost all of the receptors on their retinas are light sensitive rods. They don't really have a whole lot of the color sensitive cones that creatures that are more active during the day like us tend to have. So with those tube-shaped eyes being kind of this odd shape and huge in their heads, they're actually held in place by a special bone called the sclerotic ring. So if you ever have a chance to look at a replica skull or actually a real skull of an owl, you'll see that it will include these kind of odd looking little kind of spectacles, if you will, that are in there. That's actually the sclerotic ring that you're seeing. And that holds those tube eyes in place, which means that you're kind of limited in what you can do, but we'll talk about that in a second. So that color, those arresting colors of eyes, you may wonder, why do some owls have darker eyes and why do some have lighter eyes? And while there is no hard and fast rule, there was a study that was done a couple of years ago looking at data on eye color and the time of day that owls tended to be active. And while the vast majority of them are mostly active at night, some of them can be active at dawn or dusk, what we call crepuscular, and some of them are in fact rather active during the day or diurnal. So what they found when they looked at, a whole range of owl species across the planet was that you tended to find these dark irises, like we're seeing here in the barred owl and the barn owl on the right. They tend to be the ones that are much more active at night and much less frequently active during times when there's brighter light, versus the ones that have the more yellow or orange eyes, which, while still nocturnal, will tend to have a little bit more tendency to be active in times when there's brighter light. So kind of a cool little fun fact there. So I mentioned those fabulous eyes kind of locked in place. Well, in order to compensate for not being able to literally roll their eyes, owls can actually turn their head a full 270 degrees. So they can't, we'll see if this, we had some trouble in the tech check with the GIF, but so you may be seeing movement or not. It's an absolutely hypnotic little thing, but look for some videos of owls turning their heads, and it's pretty impressive the kind of range they can get, especially if you've ever sat at your desk and tried to do some neck stretches and realize just how limited you actually are. So their vision is amazing. Their hearing is also absolutely phenomenal. So one of the things that you may see on certain species of owls are these tufts, and we often call them ear tufts. And that's kind of a misnomer. Those are actually not at all related to their ears. They're actually tufts of feathers. I'm going to give you a vocabulary word today called plumicorns, which I just think is the greatest word. So if you happen to have little cowlicks like I do on either side of your head, mine are kind of plastered down right now, but now I'm not going to call them my cowlicks anymore. I'm going to refer to them as my plumicorns because that makes me like an owl. These tend to be more used perhaps for social signaling. Also, when you look at a lot of the pictures of owls in their habitat, they can assist the owl in blending in and camouflaging them against backgrounds such as tree bark or things like that. So the real owl hearing happens with these holes that are actually hidden by their feathers on their skulls. And some species that are particularly active hunting by hearing sounds of their prey at night will actually have very asymmetrical ear holes on their skull. Literally, one of these ear holes is higher than the other. And what this allows them to do is that sounds arrive at each of these sides, these differently placed ear holes at different times. They can actually distinguish between the sounds arriving between the left and the right down to 30 millionths of a second. One of the other cool fun facts is that barn owls do not actually experience age-related hearing loss. And there's some idea that, again, because they are so reliant on their ears for catching prey, that they may actually be regenerating some of these hearing cells that creatures like humans tend to lose as we get older. So I mentioned that near silent flight. Again, being active in the dark, you kind of have to sometimes feel your way around. So you may see some of these little bristles that owls tend to have around their beak, and those are called phyloplumes. They're not whiskers, they are actually kind of whisker-like feathers. But on their flight feathers, they actually have this fringe-like edge, these flutings, that will kind of make the feathers look a little bit furry when you look at them. And those are actually create an airfoil that muffles the sound of their feathers. So if you've ever listened to a goose or ducks flying overhead, sometimes you can hear this whoosh as their large wings and their flight feathers kind of break through the air. And with a comparably sized large owl, that doesn't happen because those feathers are specifically designed to give them that really, really quiet flight. One thing I do want to point out, since we're talking about feathers, please do note that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, this is a federal law, prohibits possessing any feathers of our native North American birds that are not game species unless you have a permit. So if you see an owl feather or a hawk feather or something lying around, absolutely, by all means, pick it up, take a look at it, take some pictures of it. But once you're done, please do leave it where you found it. So once you are in the air and you're sneaking up on your prey, how do you kill it? Owls tend to kill with their talons. So we think of a lot of birds of prey as having these really sharp bills, and they tend to. But for owls, the killing power comes in those talons. Larger owls can exert up to 29 pounds of pressure with their talons, something like a great horned owl. And they have this interesting toe arrangement. If you were to ask perhaps a 5-year-old to draw the imprint of a bird foot, they'd probably give you 3 toes forward and 1 toe back. Well, owls can actually swivel one of those toes backwards so that they have an arrangement we call zygodactyl that has 2 toes forward, 2 toes back. As you can imagine, that allows them to get a little bit of perhaps a better grip on prey when they're coming down on it. They tend to attack their prey feet first, and in some cases can actually hit it with tremendous force. So if you're talking about a mouse, some of these owls can hit it with about 150 times the mouse's own body weight worth of force. This is actually kind of an interesting, relevant thing. I'm not going to go too far into this because there's apparently a whole series of TV shows about this really kind of odd case that happened back in the early 2000s and finally wrapped just a couple of years ago, that in which an owl, specifically one of our owls, the barred owl, featured in a high-profile murder case where the defense tried to argue that the wounds on the murder victim's head were actually caused by the talons of an owl rather than by the murderer. This never actually made it into trial because the alleged murderer took a plea before it could go to trial. But it was such an odd thing that it made, there was a whole lot of press and news around it, and actually a couple of true crime specials that were produced about the staircase murder. So that said, owls have been in our culture for way longer than that. And it's really fascinating because they really have these very divergent roles in culture and tradition. Some places they're symbols of death or bad luck or omens or sorcery. For example, the Aztecs saw them as a symbol of death. They were considered to be an ill-omened bird in Rome, kind of a gateway creature to the underworld by the ancient Celts. And in other cultures, they're associated with wisdom or protection or good luck. We often think of the goddess Athena with her companion owl in ancient Greek mythology. In Japan, they're considered to be good luck. Seeing an owl in Inuit culture was considered to be a sign that you would receive guidance or help. And the Pima Indians believed that they were some of the, for example, more fierce owls like the great horned owl were actually reincarnated warriors. So a lot of different ways that they show up. And they continue to feature in our modern literature. So one of my favorite childhood books, Owl at Home, eating his pea soup by the fire. They show up in marketing. So how many licks to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? They show up in children's stories and movies. So Winnie the Pooh or other Disney movies. You can actually create quite the list of Disney movies that feature animated owls. Harry Potter featured them very prominently as the messenger owls. And then probably my least favorite owl of ever, the Duolingo owl, who is quite possibly the most manipulative owl on the planet. he cries if you don't practice your language. I was really horrified by that when I first got the crying owl. Oh, too much. And what's really fascinating is we've honed in on these features of owls with the way that their forward-facing eyes are, and they can create these feelings in us that they almost look human. And I think that's one of the things that really attracts us to owls is they have what we perceive to be very expressive faces. So one of my favorites, a very early meme, the "Oh really" owl, joined by the "Yeah really" and "No way" owls. People make all kinds of GIFs about them to talk about, like things like family reunions. And so we're seeing a little nest of baby barn owls here with the guy in the back who's kind of having some lunch there. There's even apparently, this was new to me as I was researching some of this. Some of you may have heard of the trend of people who've been doing this for years called planking, where they literally kind of lie in a plank form across two objects. Well, that was soon joined by owling. So these two young ladies are owling on a fence. Yes, this was a thing on the internet. Again, because they're so expressive, we make workplace jokes, like the coffee owls. We liken them to things that we see commonly. So, which one's an owl, which one's an apple? And even the Duolingo owl has become the subject of memes for his kind of manipulative ways. You forgot your Spanish lessons, and people are like, uh-oh, it's more than him crying. He's going to come get you. Be careful. So tons and tons of owl memes out there if you're curious about that kind of thing. So getting a little bit back closer to home, owls are one of our ecological MVPs. They're fantastic top predators within our ecosystems. They do a tremendous amount of work to control prey populations. This is probably one of the most important things that they do for us. And not just in urban and suburban areas, but in agricultural areas as well. For example, barn owls are actually considered to be a real asset in agricultural areas because they can eat an average of 4 to 5 mice a day, way more than that during the breeding season when they're actively feeding a nest full of youngsters. Here, we're actually looking at a Western screech owl who has got in his beak there, yes, that is a cockroach. These little guys can consume 25 to 30% of their body weight daily. So I decided to do a little back of the envelope calculation quite literally a few days ago. My husband was like, what is that you've scribbled out? And I'm like, it's roach body weight, trying to get a sense of how many roaches, if we're talking about the weight of a screech owl relative to the weight of a roach, you could, if an owl decided it was going to have nothing but roaches, why you would eat that, I wouldn't know. But if, that was your taste, you could be easily looking at, a couple hundred roaches a day. They probably don't realistically eat that. I don't blame them. But all to say, they can be pretty voracious predators of things that we don't necessarily like hanging around our homes. In some cases, for owls that are very sensitive to environmental impacts caused by changes to habitat, they can be ecosystem indicators, such as, for example, the northern spotted owl in the northwestern United States. That said, owls have a really interesting and fun dietary adaptation that shared with some other birds, but they're one of the birds that's most accessible for us to be able to learn more about their diet based on their pellets. So owls kind of have the habit of swallowing their prey whole, or if it's a larger prey, they'll tear it up into chunks and swallow those whole. But the bones, the fur, and some of the other non-digestible bits that go down the gullet end up getting regurgitated as an owl pellet. So if you find these, you'll tend to find them not necessarily close to nests, because that's kind of a dead giveaway that there's maybe owls here. They have areas where they roost or where they perhaps just rest, and the pellets may accumulate in those areas. So if you find one, taking it kind of to an area where you can dissect it to look at the different things that are in there can give you a pretty good sense of what that owl has been eating. They also have a really interesting family life. So again, there's a wide variety of different systems across these 200 odd species of owls, but generally speaking, most owls mate for life or form very long-term pair bonds. Also, the females are the ones who incubate the eggs, which may explain why biologically the females tend to be a little bit larger than the males. The male will generally tend to hunt for her while she's incubating her eggs on the nest and bring food back to her and to the young. And of course, if you've ever run across pictures of baby owls, they're relentlessly cute. They're born naked and helpless, but then quickly turn into these absolutely adorable fluff balls with these huge eyes, and then into fierce little hunters themselves. So let's meet some of our neighbors. Here we have a little juvenile eastern screech owl who's peeking out of a nest box. We'll talk about them first. So they tend to be what we would think of as robin-sized. So they're not going to be really big. They actually are a little bit smaller than you might think. They have very, very variable coloration. Some, like the picture we're looking at here, are this kind of reddish cinnamon color. Some are more gray, some are more brown, but they have these distinctive yellow eyes, and they do have plumicorns that may or may not be visible, so those little ear tufts. And essentially what that plumage allows them to do is blend really, really well into the bark of trees where they tend to nest or roost. They prefer to be in tree-dominated landscapes. This can include suburban and urban areas if you have a good amount of tree cover. And what they're specifically looking for is places that have cavities where they can nest. So trees that are large enough to actually have a hole in them that can be used as a nest, or they will actually also use nest boxes if you put them up. Again, being a fairly small bird, their diet is going to be mostly invertebrates. They will eat small rodents and lizards and other small birds sometimes. They are mostly nocturnal, but do have some crepuscular, so that dawn and dusk activity, and are occasionally diurnal. And let's see if I can get this to behave itself. Oop. And we're going to apologize here for this. I'm pulling up a sound here. And hopefully y'all will hear this. But they have this call that is this distinctive whinny, almost like a high-pitched horse that descends down. And then you may also hear this kind of trill that they make as well. And I've seen some birders when we go out watching birds. So one of the things, because these guys will take small songbirds, they often end up getting mobbed by a lot of other small birds. And this is a really great way to actually get some attention here from small birds if you're out birding, if you're with someone who can do a really good screech owl call. So these guys are kind of masters of camouflage. Again, looking at the way you can probably spot this owl here, but if you were quite a distance away, you might miss it if you blinked. So our next owl that we have here is the barred owl. These guys are about duck size, so they're quite a bit bigger, and their plumage isn't as variable. They are basically brown and white with mottled pattern vertical streaks on the belly, which is where their name comes from. They have completely dark eyes and a large rounded head with no plumicorns. They're going to be looking for larger tracts of older, more mature trees. Again, they are cavity nesting, will use nest boxes, but they're going to require a much bigger nest box than the little screech owls. Their diet is kind of, again, relative to their size. They're going to be going more for small mammals, lizards, small birds, some invertebrates mixed in there. They are mostly nocturnal, some crepuscular activity, and occasionally diurnal. And let me see if I can get to the calls here without having to, whoops. Well, we're just gonna do this. So they have a mnemonic that actually can help you learn or recognize their call. And so it sounds a little bit like, who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? And so you often hear them make that call. You may hear them duetting back and forth if you have a mated pair. And mixed into that, you may also get some really kind of oddball squawks and strange hooting sounds. But mostly that's what you're going to be listening for. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? So again, this was the owl, this sweet face here that some people thought was responsible for the infamous staircase murder. Who knows? One thing to note, they tend to avoid areas where you have great horned owls in residence. Great horned owls will actually attack and sometimes prey on barred owls, so you often will not necessarily find them peacefully coexisting directly in the same space. And if they had a meme ranking, it would be that they just have the sweetest little face. It just makes you feel like you're, everything is going to be fine. You're cool. It's all good. So then we get to the great horned owl. This is about the size of a large hawk. These guys have very variable plumage. The thing you want to be looking for is that white throat patch, large yellow eyes, large head, and those really prominent plumicorns, those big ear tufts. They are the most widely distributed true owl that we have in the Americas. They're going to be found in a variety of habitats, everything from forest to wooded parks, neighborhoods in cities, and have a really pretty general taste when it comes to finding a place to nest. Some will take over abandoned nests of other birds, like crows or hawks. Sometimes they'll go for cavities. Sometimes they place a nest on a ledge or a platform. Their diet is going to be mostly mammals. They will also take birds, reptiles, and invertebrates. Again, mostly nocturnal with quite a bit of crepuscular and diurnal activity, as you could see outside my place. They were going quite well after the sky was light. Their mnemonic is "Who's awake? Me too." We'll see if we can get that playing. So one thing that's kind of fun about owls is that, again, female's bigger in terms of body size, but the male's voice, especially you hear this with great horned owls, and I wish I could get a recording of what I was hearing this morning, the female's voice is actually higher than the male's. His voice is lower. His voice box, what we call their syrinx, is actually bigger than hers, even though his overall body size is a little bit smaller. So these guys are, often the target of a lot of mobbing of other birds. So that can be a clue to finding a great horned owl in the landscape, is if you suddenly hear, birds like crows. This morning, our owl on the roof apparently got chased away by a Cooper's hawk. So even other birds of prey will chase them off. They are known as the sky tiger, and with good reason. So a lot of these other birds are wanting to get them out of there. They're incredibly, dangerous to them. And they are one of the few species of predator that has absolutely no compunctions about taking skunks. Generally speaking, birds do not have a marvelous sense of smell, and owls are not bothered by spray in the least. So they are one of those predators that will take out skunks. And sometimes they have this facial expression that just always reminds you, you are kind of not very cool, but that's okay. So our last owl that I'm going to touch on really quickly, not very common around the landscapes like this. They tend to be in areas where you have more open land, where they can forage over grassland or agricultural lands, is our barn owl. So they're the ones that have this distinctive heart-shaped face. They tend to be pale overall, with a whitish belly and more buff and gray color up above. They're about crow-sized, so they're a little bit smaller than our other two larger owls. Their diet is really, really heavily made up of small mammals. Again, mice, rats, things like that. These guys are mostly nocturnal. You will occasionally hear them or see them out and about during dawn and dusk, not so much during the day. And their call, unlike some of these rather kind of melodious hoots, is quite literally a ghastly scream. Try using this as a ringtone on your phone. And that's about it. They have some hisses that they'll make, and they'll clack their bills, but no real hoots coming from these guys. They are welcomed in agricultural areas. There's actually a project in which they were introduced back into agricultural lands in Florida to control rats in sugarcane fields. They're one of those species that has those really distinctive, very, very easy to see asymmetric ear holes. And there is some thinking that they may be the origin of some of those old stories about haunted houses or haunted barns with that white appearance and sailing out across a field in the middle of the night with that horrible scream. So let's talk a little bit about some conservation. So all birds need our help. We actually have a few species of owls that are actually species of greatest conservation need in the state of Texas. Our burrowing owl, the ferruginous pygmy owl, the Mexican spotted owl, and the short-eared owl are all species that we're kind of concerned about. And they're part of this larger trend of declines in overall bird populations across North America. Since 1970, 2.9 billion birds have basically disappeared off the landscape. That comes out to be roughly 1 in 4 birds that have disappeared from the North American landscape. And this is per research that was released last fall, published in the journal Science, from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. A lot of this informed by citizen science data that people have contributed to the eBird platform. So there's a lot we can do to make our landscapes more welcoming to birds, including creating habitat, making places safer for them, and contributing our observations of them. So few easy ways to kind of help our owl neighbors. They need much the same things that we do: food, water, shelter space, and safety. Probably one of the most important things, and if you take nothing else away today, I really want to stress this: because they are top predators and because so much of their diet involves things that tend to accumulate pesticides, such as rats or mice, or perhaps insecticides in the case of some of our smaller owls, using poison baits or it can be something very harmful to them. And so simply changing the way you do pest control can actually really benefit owls around your neighborhood. So thinking about using mechanical rodent traps instead of poison bait. One of the big things that I've heard people who do rehabilitation talk about is that they will sometimes end up with owls that come in that have acute toxicity poison. They actually have ended up basically being poisoned by a buildup of too many of these rodenticides in their system. So in terms of providing them things that they want in terms of water and shelter, they will use bird baths. So many of you, if you were to set up a nighttime camera, like a game camera on your bird bath, you may find that you have some owls visiting it after dark. They will, again, as we've seen in several of these photos, take up residence in nest boxes if you get the conditions right and you have a pair that's willing to try it out. Another big thing you can do for safety of owls, especially at times when you have youngsters that are just beginning to leave the nest, is keeping track of your pets. In particular, with dogs, it can be kind of challenging because they're curious and sometimes friendly and they want to see what's going on. And they don't necessarily, mean any harm to the owl, but could put themselves at risk of an angry adult that dive bombs them or could actually harm an owlet that may be taking its first flight out. Cats are kind of a whole nother issue in and of themselves. They're kind of natural born predators, and the best thing we can do for them and their health and safety and that of wildlife is to keep them indoors at all times. So another major source of mortality for owls is often collisions. There's estimates that about, large numbers, when we've done studies of larger owls tend to end up meeting with a kind of grisly end by being hit by cars. So if you see owls in your neighborhood, kind of keep that in mind, drive a little bit slower at night. We tend not necessarily to think about that with respect to owls. Generally, we're on the look for larger things like deer that can pose a real risk, but just know that you're also sometimes benefiting owls by being extra vigilant as well. Dark skies compliant lighting can also help create an overall environment that is safer for owls and more conducive to their activities. And finally, sharing your observations with various citizen or community science projects can be a really great way to contribute to their conservation as well. So if you're just talking about being out and about and seeing them, put your observations on eBird. If you're able to get photos of them, then consider sharing them on iNaturalist as well. And if you're lucky enough to host some nesting birds, then you may want to sign up to participate in Project Nest Watch, which actually collects information on nesting behavior and patterns for a whole variety of different birds. So some of these different projects, again, that are out there, some of them are at the global scale, such as eBird and iNaturalist. Some of them are a little bit more kind of focused on North America. Some are very local as well. And so Texas Nature Trackers, we work across the state of Texas. That's our kind of regional jurisdiction. But these big projects are great ways to get involved. We have a variety of Texas Nature Tracker projects that you can get involved with. These are available to find on our website, tpwd.texas.gov/trackers. We have a tab that is for projects. It gives you links to all the variety of our different projects. We have one that is just specifically for birds in general, birds of Texas. And so if you're interested in sharing your bird sightings, your owl sightings, we'd love to have them added to this project. And so that was all that I had in terms of prepared stuff, because I was asked to leave some time for questions here at the end. Though this is my contact information. I am also active on iNaturalist, so feel free to ping me there if you'd like to as well. Email is generally the best way to get a hold of me, especially since most of us are not currently back in our offices at this point. And the last thing I do want to kind of just leave up here is just a list of some resources that y'all might find useful or helpful. So if you have questions about owl biology or want to hear some more examples of their vocalizations, learn more about their habitat or their behavior, see more pictures of them, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website, All About Birds, is absolutely fantastic. It's basically a one-stop shop online bird guide that is free to use. You don't have to sign up for anything. If you're interested in getting plans for owl boxes, then one of the best places to do that, or other bird species for that matter, one of the best places to check out is Project Nest Watch website. Because of what they're asking, the kind of data they're asking for, they actually have resources for participants to be able to download plans for a whole variety of different nest boxes suited to different bird species. And they do have several for owl boxes. So just know that if you do want to download them, I do think you actually have to put in your email address and agree to receive notifications and kind of a newsletter from them, but they are free, so there's that. And again, places to share your owl sightings. eBird will accept any type of observation. You do have to have a login in order to upload an observation or share a checklist. Same thing with iNaturalist, free login. But really, to put things in iNaturalist, you do need to have photos or sound recordings. So what's nice about owls being very vocal is sometimes it's a lot easier just to turn on the voice memo recorder on your phone and get a recording and share it on iNaturalist. And then Project Nest Watch, again, this is specifically designed for people who are kind of interested in following nests from the beginning of the nesting season to the end. And so with that, I'm going to leave this slide up, but go ahead and turn on my video and let's see, did folks have any questions?
That was a ton of great information. That was just awesome. I think plumicorns is my new favorite thing, and due to mine, I'm going to leave my camera off as well. So several of the questions that were answered were already answered in your talk, including this last slide about owl boxes. So if anybody else has anything else, feel free to start throwing them on in chat. But one of the first questions that was asked by several people, and it's a great one, it always gets asked when talking about birds of prey, is on social media, I often see posts telling people to protect their cats and infants because they saw a great horned owl in the neighborhood. How much weight can a great horn truly carry, and do people need to worry? And then somebody else followed up with, is it true that they will attack people from behind and things like that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I get to tell one of my favorite personal stories that's now going to be recorded for posterity. And I don't know if I ever actually told my parents this. So mom and dad, if you eventually see this, it's fine. It happened like so long ago. So to the first question about whether or not you should be concerned about owl attacks on pets or children, I would say that, and how much weight can an owl carry? So looking around at various sources and people who work very closely with birds of prey, the answer to what an owl can actually physically pick up off the ground and carry away is functionally not a whole lot more than its body weight. That said, again, when an owl comes down out of the sky at a pretty high velocity with those talons, it can produce a whole lot of force, and that's how they hunt. They can easily take out prey that is quite a lot larger than them. They just have to dismember it on the ground. That said, they're really not interested in hunting, certainly not hunting people. If a human is kind of the target of an attack, the thing to be kind of thinking about is, are you really close to a nest tree? And that's actually what happened to me when I was an undergrad at University of Texas in Austin. I was right after finals in spring, so I'm not wearing any sort of protective anything. I don't even have a purse on me. I just have my ID tucked in my pocket, wear my Birkenstocks, walking by the student union, and being a biology student, when I heard and saw a screech owl above my head, of course I decided I was going to stop and look. Rookie mistake. And then the second owl appeared, and I turned around. Rookie mistake number 2. The first owl came down and, lucky for me, balled up its feet into little fists and beamed me on the back of the head. So, real world example there. It felt like getting hit in the head with a high velocity tennis ball, scared the snot out of me. I took off running. And the thing that kept going through my head as a college student was, my parents are already a little kind of on the fence about this whole biologist thing. And if I have to get stitches because I was attacked by an owl, I'm going to be in so much trouble, which thank goodness they didn't. That said, what I figured out was that I was probably much too close to a tree in which they likely had a nest going, or perhaps even had youngsters out of the nest and were very defensive for them. So that is something to really think about. Not just for the safety of the owls, which I kind of mentioned in the talk, but also for your own safety or the safety of your pets or children if they're out in an area where owls are nesting, or where that they have young that are out. Once they're kind of away from the nest, generally speaking, they're not really going to be caring too much. When it comes to small pets like small dogs, probably the best advice in general, because it's not just owls you need to necessarily be thinking about, probably more need to be thinking about, being where we are in Central Texas, coyotes. Just best to always keep them on leash and supervised when they're outside. But in particular, if you do have nesting owls, just thinking about the fact that those owls can be very, very protective. And whether or not you or your pets mean any harm, it's best to kind of be cognizant of where they are and keep your distance.
Okay, next up, there were a few people that asked about rodenticides, but then you covered that pretty well in the talk. If there's anything you'd want to elaborate on that. They were just saying, have they negatively affected owls by the use of rodent poisons and things like that?
So there was one stat I was able to find with great horned owls, and there was an estimate that, at least within the scope of the particular study, that roughly 11% of the mortality could be perhaps attributed to or contributed to by rodenticides. So again, it's one of those things that may, if it doesn't outright kill them, and different ones will do different things, as we know. I mean, some of them are anticoagulants, blood thinners, things like that. Then it could contribute to poor body health, or just general kind of lack of ability to really be effective, and survive. So it could be direct effects or cumulative effects. So just because you're not necessarily seeing owls dropping out of the sky does not mean that all is well.
Okay. Then we had a couple people post about some groups in the area to raise awareness about the poisons and things. The Texas chapter of Raptors are the solution group on Facebook, and then some things about dark sky. The last question that we have is, in Central Austin, which species would I want to try to build a house for or / attract? Like the most common, maybe.
I would say, in terms of the ease of being able to have the space, the right habitat, and be able to get a box built and maintained would probably be screech owls, because again, they're relatively smaller. When you're talking about, barred owls, you're looking at much larger, and then, great horned owls are even kind of more robust than that. So in terms of actually being able to construct a box, get it mounted in a suitable place, and keep it up and maintained year from year, that would probably be the answer. Also, again, if you may find that you have friends or neighbors that have had some success and may be able to share some tips or tricks with you that worked for them in setting up screech owl boxes.
A follow-up to that question somebody else asked is, if you have an owl box, should you stay clear of it and maybe not look directly at it or mess with it to avoid the screech owls possibly attacking you? Is there any guidance to box placement?
Ooh, those are great questions, which I do not have answers to off the top of my head in terms of box placement. With some species, that kind of thing definitely matters. So that would be something I'd recommend doing some research into. You may find some additional resources with some of the blueprints that are out there for these in terms of perhaps orientation. Do you want it a certain distance away from, for example, buildings? Some of that actually with different types of nest boxes for any type of animals sometimes do matter. For other species, it often doesn't. With respect to looking directly at the box, the biggest time you probably don't want to be getting near that box is when there are young in the nest. That's where the risk of kind of perhaps having nestlings, get disturbed too early can sometimes happen. If you're standing on the ground looking up at it from the ground, especially at an angle where you're actually able to see in with binoculars or with a camera, I don't see that as an issue. Generally speaking, they tend to be pretty tolerant of, they wouldn't be nesting in your yard if they didn't, want to be around, if they were that sensitive to you literally being active in your space. But I would say, kind of give them their space when they're actively have eggs and young in the nest, and once they're kind of out and fledged, a good practice would be during the off season to check in and make sure that the integrity of the box is still intact, and that you don't have perhaps any unwanted guests that have taken up residence in there, perhaps like squirrels, or if like wasps are starting to build a nest or something like that.
Good, cool. And that's all of the submitted questions, and we're actually like 2 minutes onto our hour time. So I was going to see if Johanna had any closing remarks, and I think that's it from me.
Yeah, that was perfect timing. Thank you so much, Tanya. This was really a lot of fun and very informative. And we will be downloading the recording that we've been making, and will be available on Facebook, on the Travis County BCP website, and also on YouTube. And I will email everybody once that's ready. It might take us a little while to get that all done, but it'll be up there so you can share it with everybody, and also revisit any of the points that you may have forgotten or need a little refresher on. So, and Dr. Hamayoun, I understand you're available for questions through email as well after this?
Sure, absolutely. So just know that we are kind of in a little bit of a busy time of year. So if it takes me a little bit longer to get back to you, my apologies on that. But talking shop about owls is one of the highlights of what we do as biologists relative to some of the other tasks that we sometimes have to do. So that's the fun part of our job. So absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and hope to see you next time. We're doing this every month, so stay tuned.
All right, thanks everyone.